Now, there's a potential problem with this account of the badness of death. Recall that Epicurus and Lucretius said something could be bad for you if you weren't aware of it, so your death can't be bad for you. Nagel wants to lift those awareness requirements and the existence requirement for good and bad things to happen to you. And there are some cool features of that. I mean, one cool feature is, look, now if you break a deathbed promise, you're doing something wrong. Who are you doing it wrong to? The person who you promised to, the person who was dying, who you made a promise to. Also, a cool thing about this account is your legacy matters. So it makes sense of the fact that people think their legacy matters. Why does it matter? Well, because it's good or bad. For who? For you. Whether how things go and how you're thought of and what contributions you make, right? Even if you're not around to see them. But here's a problem. If you don't need to be aware of a bad thing happening to you for it to be bad, and if you don't need to exist for a bad thing to be happening to you, if in fact there are another category, if there's another category of bad things that can happen, and those are relational bads that neither need to be felt or happen to somebody while they're alive, then this opens the possibility that, look, when you die, it's bad for you, and it makes sense of that view, or could be bad for you. But then also, what about people who not just die or die young, but maybe even worse, are never born? And I'm not here talking about babies in the womb or fetuses in the womb. I'm here talking about potential people, like even conceptually possible people that didn't exist, or hypothetical people. So think about how many hypothetical people there are, right? There's so many hypothetical people. For every man and woman, there's all sorts of hypothetical people. And as technology evolves, there are even more potential people, right? How bad for them that their parents didn't have sex when they were the separated sperm and egg that was yet to be a person. Things could have been so much better for them had their parents had sex at that time, but they didn't, so they never came into existence, right? So we get, with Nagel's view, we are able to make sense of this intuition that death is bad and that we fear it because it's a bad thing, or that we're upset about it that it's a bad thing. But we, at the cost of tragedy happening all the time, that there's all these potential people missing out, and it's a horrible thing. A bad thing for whom? For them, even though it's difficult to say, well, at what time? While they're missing out, and they don't know it, but they don't have to know it. The existence and requirement and the awareness requirement are lifted, and the temporal thing gets fuzzier because now it's a person in terms of their history and possibilities, and these people who don't exist have possibilities that could have happened. How's Nagel going to respond to this? Well, Nagel says, look, death deprives you of, well, let's get back. How can we make sense of this? Well, one thing we could do is Lucretius had his awareness requirement. Lucretius had his existence requirement, that you have to exist when the bad thing happens to you. What we might change that up to is like a soft existence requirement, like you have to exist at some time for something to be good or bad for you. So that would fix the problem of potential people. Now, is it a little ad hoc? It is, but it just doesn't seem to be the case that these potential people is this huge problem that we need to figure out, right? It seems that it's okay that those potential people are not constantly that we're not constantly having to worry about maximizing the number of people we're bringing into the world, and that we're not morally bad for not doing that. All right, so now what about the other issue of our asymmetrical attitudes towards the time before we were born and the time after we die? We don't worry about the time before we were born. We don't begrudge the fact that we missed it. We're very upset about the fact that we're going to die. What are those attitudes justified? Lucretius thinks, no, we need to bring those into alignment, right? Nagel's going to say, you don't. There's a difference between the time before you were born and the time after you die. And that's death deprives you of life and its goods, but not being born earlier doesn't deprive you of life. You couldn't have been born substantially earlier because of just the facts of how people come into existence, right? Unless suppose there was a frozen egg and a frozen sperm and you waited a while to bring them into existence. But even still, that would just shift your timeline, right? It wouldn't give you more time at the beginning. So Nagel wants to say life familiarizes us with itself and its goods and the goods that it contains. So that's why we fear losing it. It doesn't make sense to fear or be anxious about what happened before or begrudge that non-existence, because we hadn't come to know life, the good of life, and the goods it brings, and we couldn't have been born substantially earlier, maybe just a few months or something earlier, or in the case of frozen sperm and egg, however long that lasts, right? I'm not going to get into the spore problem because this is the third video of this series, so we're just going to move on to the quiz question. So before we get to that, to sum up, is death an appropriate target of fear? That depends to a significant extent over whether is death an appropriate thing to fear for your own sake if you're going to die. It seems appropriate to fear it only if it's going to be bad for you. Is it going to be bad for you? Epicurus and Lucretius say no. Epicurus says you have to be aware of it, and you won't be aware of it. Epicurus and Lucretius point out that it seems you have to exist for something to be bad for you. It's difficult to say, like, it's not bad for you when you're alive. It's not bad for you when you're dead. So when is it bad for you? And Lucretius says we don't begrudge the time before we were born. We shouldn't be anxious about the time after we die. Nagel's here to say, oh, it can be bad for you. It's just a different class of bads. The normal bads are absolute bads. They're things you feel that are bad, pain, suffering, etc. Well, there's this whole other class of bads, which is relational bads, which it's not necessary that somebody's aware of them or even exists when they, for them to occur. And relational bads might stretch back before you were born, and they might stretch on after you die, interestingly enough. Dealt with how that brings about the problem of potential people, how he deals with it, and how he justifies our asymmetrical attitudes. So now on to the quiz questions. Quiz question 1. When is death bad for the person who dies according to Epicurus? When the person is alive, A. B, when the person is dead. Or C, neither when the person is living nor when they are dead. When is death bad for the person who dies according to Epicurus, the first author that we covered today? Number 2, according to Nagel, the last author we covered, what kind of harm is death for the person who dies? A, an absolute harm like pain or suffering. B, a relational harm of deprivation like unknowingly missing a fun party. Or C, it is not a harm to the person who dies because they can't feel the absence of life. What kind of harm is death for the person who dies according to Nagel? All right, thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you next time.